Hello, everyone. As people are joining here, we're going to wait just a couple of seconds. We get people in the room before we get started. Excellent. Hello, and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, or afternoon on the East Coast at least. If you are here to talk about Better Buildings, Decarbonization, Peer Exchange, Financing Decarbonization, you're in the right place, and we're very glad to have you. We're also fortunate to have Rick Wenger from Skyven Technologies with us today, who will be sharing a lot of his wonderful experiences about financing decarbonization. Before we get started, I've got a couple of housekeeping items for us. The first is that, as usual, this is being recorded so that we will be posting it on our Better Buildings Solutions Center. So please do keep your mics on mute while you're on here. You will have a different opportunity to be able to ask questions of our guests today. However, if you have to step out, the good news is you can access this recording again on the Solutions Center. If you're having any technical difficulties in the chat function, we'll only be using the chat for technical difficulties. And you can either send a note to everybody, or you can send a note to tech support Jasmine. Jasmine's helping us out behind the scenes today. And so she'll be able to hopefully set you in the right direction technology-wise. All right, with those out of the way, next slide, please. My name is Hannah Debelius, and I'm with the U.S. Department of Energy, and I have the wonderful privilege of working with the Better Buildings program, and in particular, our Low Carbon Pilot and Better Climate Challenge partners to advance their portfolios for decarbonization. Throughout the time today where we're together, you are welcome to ask questions anytime, and the way you're going to do that is through Slido. So right now, you should go ahead and open up a browser, either another browser on your computer or on your phone. Go to slido.com, and then you're going to put in the hashtag DOE LCP, and that's going to enter you into the room. So put in questions throughout the whole time, and then at the end, we'll have plenty of time to be able to go through those. You also can actually upvote some of those questions. So if you see someone else's question that you really like and you'd like it to be answered, you can hit the little thumbs up, and that'll move it to the top of our queue. So I'm going to pause another 5 seconds and say slido.com, hashtag DOE LCP, so that everybody goes ahead and actually opens that browser right now. Jasmine's also dropped that link directly into the chat if you want to access it. And again, as Jasmine's demonstrating, our chat will be for tech support. We'll take questions all over Slido. All right, next slide, please. So today, as I mentioned, we are going to be, we have a guest speaker with us, but first Derek Craig is going to be talking about the Financial Allies program and giving a bit of an overview of that. Then we'll go into options for financing decarbonization, and then we'll utilize slido.com to get into those speaker Q&A, and we'll have plenty of time for that. So I hope you add in questions, and again, you can upvote questions that you like. Next slide. And with that, we're driving it home today, guys. If you don't have that browser open, now is the time. You can go to slido.com, DOE LCP, and that's where we'll be drawing the questions from. Next slide. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Derek Craig, to talk a little bit more about our Financial Allies program.
Thanks, Hannah. You can go ahead and go to the next slide, Jasmine. So for a lot of you, if you're unfamiliar with the Better Buildings program, encompasses many different kind of groups and networks, and one of them is the Financial Allies. And so if you're unfamiliar with the Financial Allies, it is a group of 50 plus organizations, from startups all the way to very large organizations you might be familiar with, and they are here to support you and help you. And so we want to constantly remind folks that these are this is a network that you have access to. You can reach out to them at any time, and you can go to the Better Buildings Solutions Center and find the Financial Allies page there and reach out. And these folks are here to help discuss tailor fit solutions to financing options, and in this case specifically decarbonization. Go to the next slide. So like I was saying, if you go to the financial page, the financing navigator, what you'll essentially find is where our financial allies have contributed to these written resources that are covering all sorts of financial topics of every product type you can kind of think of, everything from your standard financing options to more nuanced ones. So whatever you're really looking for in terms of a solution to your financing considerations, this should be your first stop. And as you can see, there's all kinds of case studies, fact sheets, all of the resources, and we have a large group of active folks on that page. So very easy to find someone to talk to and the resources you need to start your journey. I can go to the next slide. And this is actually a really important slide because this is one of the best things that the Financial Navigator has to offer you. Is a nice decision tree that can really get you started on the first steps of this process and understanding what are your options and what are the various types of financing mechanisms out there. So a lot of us are very familiar with a handful of these terms, but there could be some on here that you're unfamiliar with. And so that's why this page is so great. You can go here, you can click on all of these. All of these are actually links on the Financing Navigator and can lead you to very detailed fact sheets and breakdowns of what each one of these options actually is and products and projects that are most applicable to each of them. So this is a great starting point as we're thinking about our decarbonization journeys and how do we start to finance some of these options. And if you're not familiar with a lot of these, this is the great starting point to kind of get yourself level set on some of the basic definitions and terminologies you might experience and need to be comfortable with when you're having conversations, whether it's with external financiers or within your own organization as you're planning to, how are we going to do these projects and finance them. You can go to the next slide. And all that being said, there's this next step, which is understanding how does finance build into that resilience roadmap. And this isn't just solely about decarbonization. So as we are thinking about this in the broader sense of the terms, and for much larger organizations or any organization at that point, depending on where you're at in your overall resilience journey, understanding where these different pieces fall into play there. And so whether you're at the very first step or you're actually building a very detailed resilience management plan, there's all sorts of information on this page on how to finance those strategies and help you not only plan them, but then implement them and bring them to fruition. So all this is to say is that the financial allies are here to support and answer all of your questions. If you have interest in joining the financial allies, if you're that type of an institution, or if you just want to get in touch with some of them, feel free to reach out to your DOE lead or to myself or anybody on the DOE team or Better Buildings team. We can help direct you to the appropriate party to ask those questions. But it's a really great resource that as part of a Better Buildings partner, you have access to, and we encourage everybody to leverage it. So with that, that's a quick update on financial allies. If you have questions on financial allies, feel free to put it in the chat. We'll either respond to them or follow up this call with a list of all those questions and answers and links to the appropriate resources for those questions. So with that, I won't take up any more of our time. I know we want to get into the meat of it, so I'll hand it back to you, Hannah.
Great, thanks, Derek. We appreciate that overview. And of course, as everything, it is available in the Solutions Center. And I am really looking forward to our panelists for today, because I know so many of you on the line have talked to me about your financing barriers for decarbonization. So I'm hoping that we can really dig into it. Next slide. So with that, I would like to introduce Rick Wenger from Skyven Technologies. He is a mechanical engineer with over 15 years experience reducing energy and brings a wealth of knowledge to help organizations decarbonize profitably. So with that, Rick, go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Hannah. Thanks, Derek. Yeah, thanks for having me here. I'm really excited to talk a little bit about decarbonization financing. You can go ahead to the next slide. And the next one. So first, I'll tell you a little bit about Skyven and kind of why I'm here to talk to y'all. You can next slide. So Skyven is all about decarbonizing thermal energy, specifically in manufacturing in some large commercial buildings. So that's what we do on an everyday basis. Next slide. So we're not a consultant company. We don't come in and give a list, but we are a projects company. So we exist to do decarbonization projects. And that's why we're here, because one of the mechanisms in doing a decarbonization project is the financing portion. Go ahead, next slide. And you can click through to get the 3 points up. So the first thing that, Skyven does is, identify and focus on large opportunities. So, multi-million-dollar decarbonization projects. We engage with plant and corporate stakeholders, propose a project that makes sense, and we manage and take responsibility of that project. But you don't want to hear a sales pitch from me, so we'll keep moving. Go ahead to the next slide. And you can click through these two as well. So this is where we're starting to kind of get into a little bit of why I'm here. So the way Skyven works, we're actually an energy as a service company. And so what we do is we exist to align our financial goals with your emissions reduction. And so the way we do that is that we actually charge based on the measured and verified energy saved from the projects that we put in. And when we put in a project, we have a offering to fund those projects with no capital expenditure to our customers. And that's really, as we go on in the slides, you'll see we're a third-party vendor financing option. And we'll talk a little bit about how we get there and what advantages and disadvantages are to all the different options. Go ahead to the next slide. And you can just skip this slide. I got a little animation crazy, I'm sorry. So let's talk a little bit about, the top reasons decarbonization projects fail at companies. So we really see 5 basic places, going around from the top counterclockwise. There's a lack of technical expertise to evaluate and execute, uncertainty in calculating the savings performance. Poor payback, right? Especially when compared with what we traditionally see as people's top priorities, which is throughput, safety, and quality. And of course, a lack of awareness. There's a lot of us engineers out there, but most people don't have 8 hours a day to focus on decarbonization or energy efficiency. And then the 5th one, the one we're going to talk about today, is a lack of funding. And this is one that really trips up a lot of people to where all of these combined are difficult, and then having to go through the traditional capital cycle, not being able to get funding internally from the project can be really difficult. Go ahead to the next slide. So as a consumer, you really have 2 funding paths. The first one, right, is your own funds. I don't need to tell you about traditional capital cycles. I'm sure you all know more about it than I do. But you can get funding for a sustainability project also from a third party. And that is basically anyone outside your organization. And there's a couple pathways for that, but there are actually third-party funding organizations that exist specifically to fund sustainability projects and projects that, reduce carbon, reduce your energy. Next slide. So, really there's 2 pathways, like I said, to third-party funding. The first is you can get the funds yourself. And there's certainly nothing wrong with that. You can engage with one of these lenders to try to get those funds. And it's more complicated than, say, getting a home loan where you just have to do a routine credit check. There's a whole bunch of things behind that you have to get into with them, because they want to make sure their money's protected. What happens, sustainability projects, there's this reality that if calculations are done incorrectly, or if gas prices change, things like that these projects can go underwater. So if you get the funds yourself, you're going to have to go through a bunch of checks, basically, and a bunch of mechanisms with that lender to make sure it happens, or that the project is good. I'm very familiar with that from the other side, though, because the second point is a vendor gets the funds for you, a third party, or any third party vendor, right? And we also have to go through those same checks, and then they're going to pass some of those checks and assurances onto you, but they're going to negotiate the contract with that lender. And And then the types of provisions that we pass on to our customers are pretty standard, like you'd think with a loan for a project like this. It's going to be things like equipment uptime, production minimums. What kind of seasonality do you have? And so this is like seasonality is a very interesting one, because a lot of times with a project like this, you're looking for 24/7, 365 operation of whatever that piece of equipment is, so you know what's going on. And then there's other companies that we work with that are incredibly seasonal. You can imagine, growing fruit, or making fruit juice, making tomato paste, things like that, where they only run 3 months a year, but their production volume is so high that it can make up for those sorts of things. So any vendor that works with you is going to have to understand that, and they're going to dig pretty deep into gathering data and getting your process. The really nice thing about any of these third-party funding options is you don't have to put any upfront capital in. And in the sustainability projects world for companies, one of the big hurdles that we find is that getting into the capital cycle with a sustainability project so often gets overshadowed with throughput, safety, quality projects, right? And so this is a way to kind of take things out of the capital cycle. It's a totally different model, which presents its own challenges, right? Because all of a sudden you're having to re-engage with finance on a totally different type of model. You're having to re-engage with ops on what it looks like. But these are both really good options for you to potentially get financing for your sustainability and your decarbonization projects. Next slide. So, here are some key evaluation criteria when you're looking at third-party financing, and there's a whole bunch of stuff to consider here. I won't read you the slide, but kind of looking at the different categories. The first two, equipment ownership during the term and accounting implications, they're really very tied together. So when you're thinking about the equipment, if somebody else is funding it, if you get a vendor to fund it, who owns the equipment, right? And it really is, it is tied to on and off balance sheet things. It's tied to, is it a lease versus a service agreement? And you just need to make sure you understand that, who would own the equipment, and then what ownership of the equipment actually means. Does it mean, if Skyven owns the equipment or any vendor owns the equipment, does that mean we would tell you how to run that equipment? If, you put in a multi-stage heat pump, are we going to meter the amount of steam or hot water, and are we going to turn it off without your permission? So what does ownership mean is incredibly important, and digging into those details with whatever vendor you're engaged with. Another thing is on the common sectors, public versus private. I can tell you from firsthand experience, this is something that vendors are going to look at. Look at the tolerance for risk, and also, is there a bid process? And if you're looking at third-party financing and you have to go through a bid process and get 3 competing bids, how does a third-party finance bid with no capital outlay but a 10-year term or 20-year term compare with a traditional bid? Or if you get 3 bids from third-party contractor or third-party funding, what does that look like? So a lot of things to consider there. And another thing kind of in that same vein is, what is, if you're going to engage a vendor, what is their offering? What does their offering look like? And figuring out how to make apples to apples comparisons between, kind of all those things that they were showing us in that tool what do those look like that Derek was walking us through. A couple more things, we have different payment structures. There's different M&Vs that has to happen, measurement and verification. Is it calculated? Is it real-time measured? And then what happens at the end of the term of that equipment? Is it a purchase at a fair market value, bargain values? There's all sorts of things you need to consider. And I know these are all very common things, conversations that we have with our customers. And what it kind of ends up doing is making a very multi-leveled sale, because you're going to have to convince, finance of certain things, and we need to get finance and legal involved during it. So we can go ahead to the next slide. I want to dig a little bit into on balance versus off balance sheet, because this is a really critical piece. And so if you go to the first bullet point here on what a lease is, so a lease transfers control over some aspects of that asset to the customer. So we all know how a lease for a car, maybe you've had a lease for an air compressor or something works, but you're going to have a little bit more control. With a lease, you can just turn that piece of equipment off and let it sit there, and you still have to make your lease payment every month, but there's no other clauses that could kick in. If you go to the next bullet, but with a service contract, the supplier is going to own the equipment. So when Skyven does a contract with someone, we actually own that equipment over the term. You actually pay for the output of the equipment. So again, put in heat pumps, it's delivering hot water. You're going to pay for that essentially clean hot water that's going into your plant to do whatever there is in a process. And so there are good parts of somebody like us owning the equipment. One is that they're typically going to take maintenance responsibility because they need that piece of equipment to be up and running. They need it to be delivering that energy because you're paying for the output. That's how that's how we get paid, right? It is from the output of it. And then there are some potential downsides on how that equipment can be operated. And it's really important to dig into those details with any vendor you're engaging with. And so what does it mean that we own the equipment? Does that mean that we can throttle how much it runs or shut it down at any time or any of that stuff? Those are really important details to get into. And, in the Q&A, if y'all have questions about it, I'm happy to dig in more on that. And then the third bullet is, this is a critical piece and it can't be overstated. Any vendor is going to say, yeah, we've structured a contract to be off balance sheet, or we've structured a contract to be a lease or a service contract or whatever. But the reality is that your internal accounting department and potentially lawyers, they need to be the ones that actually determine if it's on balance sheet or off balance sheet. And so don't let a vendor, me or anybody else, tell you that something is on balance sheet or off balance sheet. It's okay to listen to them about it and dig in a little bit, but it has to be determined by your internal accounting. And U.S. businesses can actually be different than say foreign-owned businesses, even with entities in the U.S. There's different accounting practices and different ways these things are taken care of. Rules just changed, I know, in last December. So there's all sorts of things here that it's just, maybe I'm overemphasizing the point that you need to really dig into it and make sure that, you are determining what this is. Next slide. So we wanted to go through a couple case studies here with you. So the first case study, these are two projects that we have worked on. So the first case study is with a large national butter manufacturer. You can see the projects over there. We're doing solar thermal installation, condensing economizer, steam trap management. It's having a very big impact. We're very, very, very proud of this project. And, essentially what we're doing is we're saving 223,000 million BTU annually, reducing their CO2 by 1,200 metric tons at zero CapEx to this customer. There is also a strong grant component here, and you see that on the one right side. Large grants and incentives were available for this to really make this super economically feasible. And so what made this project go as opposed to some other projects that didn't go? And we'll talk about one that actually didn't go well next. But having a strong project champion is of the utmost importance for these projects. Going back to what I was saying before is that you do need a whole bunch of stakeholders to buy into this, and they need to buy into a different business model than what you're probably used to. Even if you're getting the third-party capital yourself, it's still a different business model in the way that the company's looking at it. And, there's no upfront capital outlay from your company, but you're stretching it out differently over a period of time. So getting a strong project champion that's going to push this project to the different key stakeholders and dig into the details, or get your vendor in front of people. I see my kids making an appearance in the background. The perils of working from home. So by getting a strong project champion that's going to be able to push all this is of the utmost importance. And I really can't oversell that. So when you're thinking about getting third-party financing, working with, if you're working with a vendor, working very closely with that vendor, getting expectations set really well from the vendor. I was just talking to a customer yesterday and they were asking me, well, what's the best process? And it's like, we need to get finance involved really early to understand the business model, because otherwise that's a huge tripping point down the line. If you go into engineering and all of a sudden someone, kicks up some dust about the business model, it can really set you back. So any vendor that you work with is going to know kind of the right way to go about it, but having that strong project champion. In this case, the customer was open to a new business model, right? They wanted to get the large grants and incentives available in California. They were open to this idea of not outlaying capital. They were initially resistant. And what you'll find probably in your organizations is some initial resistance. I hear this with almost everybody I talk to is, well, our company won't do a 10-year term. Our company doesn't want someone else owning the equipment. We want to have the maintenance be internal. They're all valid concerns. And getting over those hurdles can take a little bit of time. That's what we had to do here. And what it really comes down to in a lot of those cases is that 10-year terms or, longer or shorter, whatever, long-term contracts have been evaluated before in the company, but maybe they don't look quite like the one that you're looking at now. Maybe that was a long-term lease, and this is like an off-balance sheet one where you're paying for energy and the risk is being deferred to someone else, like a vendor. But being open to the new business model is incredibly important. Another thing that went right here is honestly a low risk to throughput, safety, and quality, right? We find one of the biggest things with sustainability projects is that, especially at the plant operations and the corporate operations level, there's always a resistance because there's this risk to making whatever the widget is, and making the butter, right? Trying to make the butter differently. These projects don't have any interaction with the product. It's just, say, making hot water to go into a boiler, so reducing a boiler load, or it's dealing with the steam traps that you already have and monitoring them, right? So making sure that a project is not super risky on top of a non-traditional business model is something that can really help these projects go forward. And then the fifth one, probably not a huge surprise to anyone, but it was economically viable. It had great payback. It had a really good IRR. And one of the interesting things that we find when working with customers is it's a totally different business model, right? And you're going to deliver a project with no capital outlay. And sometimes, the customer is going to see an OpEx decrease, but it still needs to hit certain payback thresholds because no one's quite comfortable operating totally out of the current capital, process. And so making sure that the project is economically viable is of critical importance, of course. And then next slide. So let's talk about something that didn't go right. And if you can put all the what went wrongs over there. So we were working with a large ethanol producer. We were looking to put an industrial heat pump in and a natural gas fired CHP system. Another project with huge savings, 174,000 million BTU, big CO2 reduction, 100% scope 1 emissions. Obviously, as a decarbonization company, that's like our holy grail there. Again, zero CapEx model, but this one really died on the vine for us. And so why did that happen, right? The first one is the opposite of the success story. We didn't have a project champion. And it's kind of in combination with the second point is there was mid-project employee turnover. Both of those things, kind of one can lead to the other, right? but we didn't have a good internal champion who wanted to push the project, who was willing to stick their neck out a little bit to engage a whole bunch of different players in the organization. In combination, some of the people that were comfortable with the project as we were going through some of the engineering phases, they left the company in the middle. And then you get someone new in who may not be as comfortable with a new business model, right? And if you don't have a strong project champion to internally convince that person, these projects can definitely die on the vine. And I will say this was it still would be, but is a great economic project from an economic standpoint. Fantastic payback on this. What else went wrong? So on some of these, the project path can be too complicated and bumpy at times, right? With any sustainability project, there's bound to be some complications, some bumpiness. In this case, we were looking at having to, lease equipment from the city that was on site. And, so there ended up just being a whole bunch of hurdles that were really not related to throughput, quality, and safety necessarily, because in many cases, not all of them, but the reality is with some of these sustainability projects, these aren't things that are going to, that are need to do. A pump breaks, you have to fix it, right? An air compressor goes down, you have to get a new air compressor. These are projects that we all want to do. And, obviously, climate change is of critical importance, but, that's when businesses look at these, they're not directly related to throughput, safety, quality. So any complications, bumpy paths, any stops and starts with a vendor or anybody else can really kill these projects quickly. And the other thing that went wrong at this site specifically, they had a lot of other competing projects. So they're a very forward-thinking company. They're really trying to be at the forefront of all this. And that meant there were a whole bunch of other sustainability projects going on in various levels of completion or scoping even. And so when you get a whole bunch of competing projects, if there are bumps and you don't have a champion and you get a little bit of turnover, all of a sudden priorities can get shuffled. And so just understanding the landscape of what you're getting into is really critical, and building a strong bond with whoever you're working with on this. It really can't be overstated. So we always like to say that we're almost like an extension of our project's internal or our customers' internal projects teams. That's how we try to operate. And so getting that sort of relationship with whoever your vendor is really of critical importance for these projects to make sure that you're working together to overcome hurdles. Next slide. So, going a little bit into this, what can you do to push third-party financing energy projects? I probably beat on this drum enough, but having an internal champion or becoming one yourself really truly can't be overstated. It has to have somebody in there that honestly is willing to stick your neck out a little bit and push one of these critically important but sometimes overlooked projects forward. Next bullet. Setting clear expectations are always important. It does have to be a priority. If you're working with a vendor, letting them know what needs to happen to move this forward, what financial thresholds need to be hit, all of that, again, of critical importance. And next. So, this one I hit on a little bit. Yeah, you can pull the fifth one up too. So educating your team on alternative financing paths, involve the finance team super early. This one it's almost like counterintuitive, because a lot of times the finance team wants to be brought in once a project is all scoped out. You almost have to do the opposite here. Get them on board with this third-party financing or a third-party finance vendor situation as early as you can, so that you don't do a whole bunch of work and then run into a roadblock. So it's a little bit different than what I traditionally see with some, like projects at other big companies that I worked in. Pulling in grant and tax experts. A lot of the times these projects work well, they always work a lot better with large grants and incentives. So pulling in an expert, whether that's somebody that you hire, whether it's a vendor who has deep expertise in grants and incentives, it's going to allow you to have a lot better ROI so that things make sense across the organization, and reducing the payback on any of these projects is just going to be beneficial for everyone. And then, of course, the Inflation Reduction Act is providing a lot of opportunities to improve ROI. There's another DOE funding opportunity announcement out right now with deep decarbonization, grants that are making some of these projects that have been a little difficult to pay back really economically beneficial right now. So I always tell everybody that we're living in a very unique time for decarbonization, specifically with all these grants and incentives coming out. It's like, it's kind of the best time in the US, in North America, to be pushing these projects, because there's so much funding, so much support, really a groundswell of support. And then the fifth and last one, evaluate different finance providers and services. Set up a matrix or whatever makes sense for you. Where do you need support that they can cover? Is your limitation in terms of project management? Is your limitation in terms of scoping out a project, but you want to manage the whole thing? Do you need help through the whole process and everything, and you just want to outsource it and have somebody else do it for you with, obviously back and forth input? What makes the most sense for you? Everybody's going to have a little bit different services. And in this space, it's even a little bit deeper, because there's different ways that people measure or calculate savings. To that other slide that I was talking about, there's all sorts of different things that you need to evaluate to come up with a solution that works best for you and your company, the project champions, and then, of course, whoever you're working with. And I think that's the end of my presentation. So yeah, please let me know any questions that came up in the chat for me or for Derek or Hannah.
Great. Thank you so much, Rick. I really appreciate that. That was a lot of wonderful information and examples and tidbits that I know that people would be able to take away from.